The Florida Keys, a world-famous fishing and diving destination.
It's the third largest barrier reef in the world. It supports basically an annual economy of about $6 billion a year, but it also suffers from significant use from a regional population on the order of about 7 million people in the three-county South Florida area.
As Florida's population has increased, the health of its coral reefs, which form the foundation for the state's large fishing industry, has drastically declined. With it, so have fish populations.
Man loves to fish, catches too many fish, therefore the numbers go down.
To better understand how fish populations are doing, a team of scientists dives regularly to conduct a census of the fish that live on the reef.
The main reason that we're out here counting fish is really to try to get some better understanding of what's happening with these coral reef fish populations. And the best way to do that is to put divers in the water and actually have them go and count and size the stuff that they're seeing.
To collect this data in remote locations like the Dry Tortugas, scientists use a highly efficient and streamlined process.
Go divers, go.
It's kind of like a paramilitary assault on marine resources because we're doing on the order of 100 scientific dives a day. So the process of having a custom ship with a very skilled captain and crew with highly trained divers gives us great flexibility and latitude to sample large areas accurately and provide information really that nobody has been able to capture before.
What will the divers find? Are fish populations recovering in South Florida? Dry Tortugas National Park is one of the lesser-known jewels in the national park system. It is famous for its 19th century Fort Jefferson, a remote Union outpost located on an island 70 miles west of Key West. Most visitors come to the park on a day trip to see the fort, the thousands of birds that nest on a nearby island each spring, and to snorkel around the fort's moat walls. But only a few visitors get to see what makes up the vast majority of the park.
97% or more of this park is actually underwater. That's what we are out here to study.
The park's roughly 100 square miles of magnificent underwater resources make up the westernmost part of Florida's reef chain.
The living reef starts about Key Biscayne, which is about 30 miles north of Key Largo, and then runs at least to the Dry Tortugas, so about 270 kilometers southwest on the southwest Florida shelf.
The health of the reefs and the fish that live there has drastically declined over the last half-century. With more and more people arriving in South Florida, fishing pressures increased dramatically. In the early years, no data was collected on the fisheries. It wasn't until the late 1970s that scientists began to analyze how fish populations were doing. Now, each year, researchers from various organizations and agencies dive in to count the fish on the reefs.
What we're hoping more than anything is that this research will give us some understanding about how these resources are doing. When I say resources, in this case, I'm talking primarily about coral reef fish communities, particularly with an emphasis on the exploited species like snappers and groupers.
To cover as large of an area as possible in Dry Tortugas National Park, the highly skilled science divers have developed a unique method to collect their data. They spend 1 to 2 weeks at sea on a chartered liveaboard, making multiple dives each day.
A regular sport diving charter, we typically tie to buoys where we're moored, so the dive times are very regimented. With a group of divers like this, we dive all day long. We dive with 5 teams of divers rather than all the divers getting off the boat at one time and then getting back on the boat at one time. And we do that for a couple of different reasons. One is to get more dive sites in during the day, and the other one is that the divers can each see something different and they get more ability to count fish in different locations.
Captain Frank uses a commercial charting program to find the predetermined dive sites.
The scientists can give me a list of where they want to go, and they give that to me electronically. We insert it into the computer. It pops up what's called a waypoint on the screen, and then I can move the boat to the waypoint. I use the depth sounder to search around for something interesting near the waypoint, be it a ledge, coral reef, a pinnacle, something like that. We don't want to just drop them in sand. Sand isn't where we're going to find our fish.
Team 5 against the wall. Team 5. Divers on the wall, please.
And it kind of works like a factory. Basically, we have 5 teams. Each team consists of 4 divers, so two buddy pairs. Captain Frank takes the boat to the GPS point.
Divers ready? Ready. Roger that. We have a pinnacle and 60 feet of water to the bottom, 40 feet of water to the top. Go divers, go.
Each buddy pair has a dive flag, and they descend to their site, and they tie off the flag.
Then they swim about 50 feet apart, and each of them imagines a circle with a radius of about 25 feet. So ideally, those circles will be touching just at the very edge. So they can still see each other, so if someone runs into a problem, something happens, the other diver can offer some assistance. But they're far enough away that the circles do not overlap, so each sample then is independent.
So then once the divers are situated and they've figured out what their cylinders are, they start counting fish. It takes an experienced diver. Takes a diver who can identify fish, and then what we do is we have this extensive training program that each fish diver goes through to standardize how they estimate the sizes of fish and whether or not they're able to count the numbers of fish. That sounds easy, like 1 fish, 2 fish, red fish, blue fish, not so much actually. Occasionally you have huge schools go through hundreds of fish, and you know, how many fish is that? You can't count each one, so you have to have a good eye of how to estimate abundances of fish.
We try to start with the most commercially important species, things like the big snappers and the big groupers. When we see them, we count them immediately and we estimate their sizes immediately, because in many cases they tend to be a little skittish towards divers and are more likely to swim off quickly, and so we want to capture those as immediately as we can and then go through the rest of the species that we see in the area, usually starting with the bigger things that are left, moving down to the smaller species, because the smaller species are much less likely to swim away. Each diver takes down a measuring stick, which is called an all-purpose tool. It's sort of like a T-stick that's about 1 meter long, marked with 10-centimeter increments up the meter stick, and then the T part is about 30 centimeters across with a ruler that actually has centimeters on it so we can see. And what we use that stick for is to help us estimate the sizes of these individual fish, because size structure is very, very important. Large fish tend to be much older, and basically the number of babies that they make is much, much larger than smaller fish. And so knowing that there are 4 fish is important, but knowing that there are 4 big fish is much different than knowing that there are 4 small fish.
Also, when divers go in the water, they're not just collecting information about the fish, because the fish, aren't acting alone. They're responding to their environment. We're also collecting data about the habitat and the water quality. And we're looking at that data in relationship to any trends that we see in the fish populations to see whether or not it's actually something happening to the habitat that's changing the distribution of fishes that we see.
It's important because the coral reefs are actually the structures that allow the nurturing and raising of juvenile fishes and allowing larger fishes to, say, hide from predators. You've probably heard of the integral web of life. Each thing has its place.
Once the divers are done counting, it's time to head back to the surface.
They meet at the center where their flag is. There's a GPS attached to the buoy itself at the surface, so we have the exact location of where those two counts occurred. And after that, they all come up together.
Roger, divers on the surface. We'll go pick them up.
And then the boat pulls around.
We're cover divers.
Picks them up, and they get on board and do it all over again 5 or 6 times a day.
Lots of relief, no crew again.
26 feet, 20 minutes, 2,400 pounds.
So it's kind of a cool process that we're just constantly dumping divers, picking them up, and within the course of a day we'll hit 25 sites, and that's 25 sites times 4 divers. So that's a whole lot of dives and a whole lot of hours underwater that we get by doing this kind of cruise.
When a team is back on the boat, they enter the data recorded on the dives.
The less glamorous side of marine biology involves entering and managing all of this data. So after we get out of the water, people need to come in, sit in front of the computers and enter their data, double check it to make sure that they've done it correctly. At the end of the trip, it'll go back to each individual agency. They'll double check it again to make sure that the data's been entered correctly, and then it gets all collected and put in a central database where all the agencies have access to it.
Scientists from 4 different agencies and institutions are along on this particular trip to collect data. They work for the National Park Service, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Florida Fish and Wildlife Conservation Commission, and the University of Miami Rosenstiel School of Marine and Atmospheric Science.
One of the things that I first noticed about this particular group of divers is the cooperation level between different agencies, both federal and state, is very high. In other places that I've been, in other states that we've worked in, particularly along the Gulf Coast, it's very difficult to get all those agencies working together to make a mission like this gel like this particular mission does.
For many years, the various groups were counting fish independently, often duplicating their efforts.
So we got together and did a big meeting, compared kind of the data that we accumulated through the years, and decided that it will be more efficient to actually gather other forces and our crews and survey all together.
To streamline the process and make the surveys more efficient, a formal protocol was devised as a guideline.
Actually, creating the protocol document allowed us to really critically evaluate every single step of the actual method, from the training, from the statistical design, from the actual in-water taking of the data, all the way to the proofing and data analysis. We want to be able to present a united front and have all of the agencies agree on what actually, the trends are.
There's a beauty in that process too. One is that we're now not doing different kinds of things and reporting different information. We're on the same page. Secondly, by adding this incremental effort in a team process, we're getting a more precise estimate over a broader range of areas.
We've been able to cover much more territory in a much more efficient manner so that we're getting the best snapshot of what's happening on the reef over time.
I'm really excited about this because it's turning out to be kind of the hallmark, if you will, of a way that a cooperative program can produce information that's relevant to scientific decision making, but also stands as a model not only in Florida, but Puerto Rico, the Papahānaumokuākea National Marine Monument, the Coral Reef Reserve in the northwestern Hawaiian Islands, and throughout the Pacific. So it's very exciting and making a difference.
All righty, guys, you guys ready? Hello? Team 4 ready? Roger that. Team 4 is ready. Diving a site called Jerry's Kids. Jerry's Kids, first discovered in 2002 by the Spree.
So how did the scientists know where to dive to count the fish?
We have a kind of a collaged habitat map for the whole Dry Tortugas National Park. It's broken up into little grid cells, 200 by 200 meters. Each cell is classified as to a type of habitat. A lot of it is not reef, so that's just not sampled at all. So if it's sand or seagrass or something like that, we don't bother with it.
For this particular study, scientists are only interested in sampling coral reef habitats because this is where most of the fish can be found.
The strategy is to try to place samples strategically in high-density areas, much like if I were going to go sample the U.S. population. I wouldn't spend a lot of time in the Mojave Desert because there aren't many people, but I identify places like cities, New York, Chicago, Miami, Baltimore, etc., where those would be, because those are places I need to get more information from.
Scientists have categorized or stratified the reef into 8 different types of habitats they want to study.
There's, very complex spur and groove, four-reef habitats, and then there's little patch reefs that occur.
Since it would be impossible to survey every single location within these vast reef habitats, a computer chooses random GPS points where the scientists will dive.
We run a random number generator routine to pick, so say for instance I have a habitat with 50 sites in it total, and I want 10 of them. From numbers 1 through 50, it'll pick 10 numbers. So then those get tagged onto that grid cell, and then we create the sampling map.
So the idea that by doing that is we're getting a fairly good estimate of fish abundance in each habitat throughout the entire region.
So we get an unbiased estimate of what's going on, which is extremely important for scientific credibility.
This approach to fisheries management is called fishery-independent sampling, because scientists evaluate living fish populations instead of counting the fisherman's catch.
Rather than going and counting fish on the dock, what we're doing is going in the water and counting what's left after the take. Historically, the focus was more on yield, meaning removal from the fisheries, as much as thinking forward about how do we sustain the resources. So more contemporaneous fishery management has thought critically about what we're leaving in the water rather than what we're taking out. We began to realize in most of the important fisheries that there were massive reproductive decline. Stocks were collapsing when in fact we thought they should sustain themselves.
Worldwide fisheries have declined drastically, with some estimates predicting that if business continues as usual, most major fish stocks will be depleted by 2048. Florida, too, has seen the numbers of its fish decline over the years.
To some extent, it's death by 1,000 cuts. The fishery has been very long-term. They've been catching reef fishes technically from the reef since Flagler's Railroad, which basically reached Key West, I think, about 1912. It intensified significantly in the pre-war years, 1930 up through 1940. After 1950, it was Katy bar the door. Along with air conditioning and access to South Florida, the reef fishing was a very popular destination for a lot of folks. And so the take, if you will, has been significant.
Florida's population has increased exponentially since World War II.
We're about 20 million people in the state now. By 2020, we're talking about 40 million people.
And it's not just the commercial fishing industry that's putting pressure on marine stocks. In 2001, Floridians owned roughly 1 million registered recreational boats, most of which are outfitted with the latest technology to find fish.
I grew up in Miami and grew up fishing with my family since I was about 5 years old. And we used to go out on charter boats and we would come back with an incredible catch. Very diverse, very large fish, a couple of groupers, a couple of snappers, our freezer was always stocked. And over time, personally, as I look back on those photos, same charter boats, same locations, the fish tended to get smaller and much less diverse. So personally, within my lifetime, I've definitely seen the impact of fishing pressure on the resources here on the Keys.
The closer you are to population areas, of course, like Miami and the Keys, the declines have been more drastic than, say, out here, because this is a remote area. But across the board, it's declined.
And overfishing hasn't been the only cause for the decline in fish populations. Pollution, coastal development, and a number of other factors all have had a negative impact on Florida's reefs. In the 1990s, scientists made a disturbing discovery.
70% of the snapper grouper complex in the Florida coral reef ecosystem, population levels were below the size considered sustainable by state and federal mandate, and that sent a real shockwave through the system That conclusion led to really a series of strong management actions that were required by law to try to repair the system, if you will. And they involved, of course, which were habitual over time, but size limits and bag limits, typical fishery controls.
The decline in numbers also contributed to the creation of marine protected areas along the Florida reef chain.
Marine protected areas give our resources a chance to rest, I think is the best way to describe it. They're free from fishing pressure, free from environmental pressure. It allows things to kind of grow without kind of these everyday kind of assaults on them. So I think given time, just about everything can recover. And so I think that's what our coral reefs really need, is time to recover, and a little bit of care from us on the land side to try and ensure that that can happen.
It's like the bank, you know, you're banking your fish, I guess. It takes time.
Today, there are several marine protected areas inside and around Dry Tortugas National Park. One of the major goals of the fish counts is to compare the size and abundance of fish populations inside and outside of those areas over time.
We would expect to see in places where you close an area to fishing, we'd expect to see higher numbers and larger individuals, particularly of the exploited species. In this case, those would be things like the snappers and groupers. There's also evidence from other places that suggests that even diversity can increase in these areas as well.
While most of the marine protected areas in the Dry Tortugas region are still relatively new, one area that was established in 2001 has already shown positive signs of recovery.
We would have expected a recovery with release of fishing mortality, but technically what we were expecting would take about a decade to get the response we expected. Surprisingly, in 2004, we saw recovery of a number of the important exploited reef fishes, snappers, groupers, black grouper, red grouper, button snapper, yellowtail snapper, etc. Abundance was going up, but also we were getting a higher number of mature fishes, which is the sure signal for the future to say that we're getting, if you will, that recharge of the system that in essence is ensuring long-term sustainability.
Protecting marine habitats from fishing pressures not only benefits the immediate area, but may also have spillover effects that help to repopulate regions that are still open to fishing.
Because of where the Dry Tortugas sits relative to the rest of the Florida Keys, kind of at the very start of the Gulf Stream, the Gulf Stream is moving from here to the east and then up to the north around the rest of the Florida Keys. So there's a good deal of evidence that suggests that reproduction that occurs here in the Dry Tortugas actually will seed the rest of the Florida Keys. So in that sense, it could actually be a very, very important place for the rest of the Keys.
Surprisingly, the concept of marine protected areas is still a relatively new idea. Worldwide, only 0.8% of the oceans are protected from human pressures, even though the oceans cover 70% of this planet. Compare that to 12% of Earth's landmass that is protected in the form of national parks and preserves.
Marine spatial planning took a long time to kind of get off the ground. I think now it's, especially with results like what we're seeing here in the Tortugas, it's becoming a much more accepted tool for fisheries management. And so we're hoping that it can be used in the future. It'll be used to ensure that the resources are available for all of our children. I have a 3.5-year-old and I wanted to be able to go fishing and diving as much as I had a chance to do when I was a kid.
After 10 days at sea, the boat heads back to port in Key West. In their quest to better understand Florida's reef fish populations, The 25 scientists on board conducted a total of 858 dives on 238 dive sites, spending a cumulative 455 hours, or 19 days, underwater. All the data collected on this trip, and others like it, will give managers the tools to hopefully make better, more informed decisions about Florida's fisheries in the years to come, and to ensure gems like Dry Tortugas National Park will be around for future generations to enjoy.
This really is a beautiful place. This isn't scientists' parks. This isn't fishermen's park. This is people's park who live in Oklahoma. And if we don't preserve it, then in the future, we've really lost the point of making it a park. This is everyone's park.
They are a Florida icon, smart, agile, and playful. Dolphins have sparked the imaginations of many, and their undersea world might be linked with ours more than we know.
We look at the bottlenose dolphins as very good sentinels of the health of the coastal ecosystem.
Dolphins are a barometer. They're an apex predator in an environment that we all share.
They're breathing the same air that we breathe. They're swimming through the same water in which we swim. They're eating the same fish that we catch. And granted, we're not in the water as much as they are, and we're not eating as many of the fish, but if problems were going to show up, we would expect them to show up in the dolphins first.
For decades, toxic chemicals have made their way into the oceans, leaving fish and marine mammals vulnerable.
Dolphins that have washed up in various places, including the southeast United States, they have to be treated as toxic waste. The levels of contaminants are so high.
Some animals showed disturbing signs of immune system dysfunction and disease, which may be linked to contaminant exposure.
They're kind of like the 400-pound miner's canary. These animals are telling us what's happening. We've used the oceans as our toilet for centuries, and now I think we're starting to see the effects of that through all these new health issues that are coming up.
So if these dolphins here on our coastlines, these apex predators, they're getting sick, well, who's next? And it's the humans.
Bottlenose dolphins are common in Florida waters. They are social animals which eat about 20 pounds of fish a day and can live to be over 50. Dolphins have few natural predators other than man. As the population along Florida's coastline increases, so do the threats to the curious marine mammals.
Increased boating traffic leads to boat hits. Dolphins are increasingly entangled in fishing line or ingesting the fishing gear that leads to their slow and painful death.
And not all threats to the animals are as obvious. Contaminants which are lurking beneath the surface are also impacting the marine mammals' long-term health. In the coastal waters off Miami, scientists with NOAA's National Marine Fisheries Service have been studying bottlenose dolphins for more than 15 years.
Did you see him again yet? Oh, there he is, Joe.
A photo ID study helps the researchers gather information about the resident dolphins.
The dolphins get natural markings and nicks and scar patterns on their dorsal fin. We take photographs of those. Then back at the lab, we can match animals up to the photo ID catalog, and that's what allows us to follow the population over time to understand their movement patterns.
I think we got him pretty good, huh?
Through observation, the scientists discovered that the animals live in distinct areas,
Certain animals tended to be sighted primarily in the northern half of the bay by the city of Miami and the port of Miami, where other dolphins tended to be more in the south towards Card Sound.
The northern half of the bay is close to urban development, while the southern half is mainly surrounded by agriculture. To find out if the northern group of animals has higher levels of contaminants than the southern dolphins, the experts collected small blubber samples.
All right, the next one he comes up, I'm gonna take a shot.
We fire a small dart with a stainless steel sampling head that hits the dolphin and has a float to keep it from going too deep and allows the dart to bounce off. The dart then floats and we're able to pick it up and retrieve the sample. And it's only about 1 centimeter in diameter. It's a very small sample.
The biopsy samples were analyzed for a group of contaminants called persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, which have been found in marine mammals around the world.
We looked at over 80 compounds, PCB congeners, DDTs, which are pesticides, and also the PBDEs, which are flame retardants. The PCBs historically were used in industry in things like transformers and have been banned from production but are still found in some older transformers and equipment today.
DDT is a pesticide made infamous in the 1960s when its harmful effects on human health and the environment became known. The use of it and PCBs was banned in the United States in the 1970s. But these compounds degrade very slowly. Transported by wind and ocean currents, high levels of these toxins can still be found in the environment today, in as far away places as the Arctic.
These chemicals are very, very persistent in the environment, and we're still finding them in organisms all over the world.
Another potentially harmful group of contaminants called PBDEs are still legally produced in most U.S. states.
The flame retardants are currently produced today, and we're concerned about those because they're very similar in structure to PCBs. They persist in the environment, they can be toxic, they are known to transport around the world in a similar way that PCBs did, and they're found in our homes on a regular basis now. They're in our electronics, in our furniture, in our carpet, in our cars, used as flame retardants widely.
Exposure to these chemicals has been linked to a number of health problems.
All of those chemicals have been identified as most likely endocrine disruptors. They can impact the immune system, they can decrease reproductive success, they can cause problems with the hormones such as estrogen levels and thyroid hormones. They can also impact neurological development, so they are definitely compounds of concern for both dolphins as well as humans.
Marine mammals are especially vulnerable to these pollutants because they bioaccumulate in the animal's blubber.
The organic pollutants bind to fat cells, and so they'll be bound to particles in the sediment, and then the small organisms that feed off the sediments will accumulate the contaminants from the sediment. The larger fish eat the smaller fish, and it continues to accumulate up the food chain because those contaminants are binding in the fat stores. So the animals that are on the top of the food chain are getting much larger doses that have been accumulated through the food chain over time, and that's true for both dolphins and humans.
There we go.
In Miami's Biscayne Bay, scientists discovered that the northern group of dolphins did have higher levels of most contaminants than the southern group.
We found that the northern group had extremely high levels of PCBs, and in fact the males in the northern half of the bay had 5 times higher PCBs than those in the southern half of the bay.
As a matter of fact, the dolphins in northern Biscayne Bay have the highest levels of PCBs of all the dolphins studied in Florida.
I would expect higher levels of contaminants here because of a higher urban area, more industrial inputs. Even going back in the 60s and 70s, Miami was much more populated than some of these other areas of Florida.
Since dolphins and humans eat some of the same fish, several people have questioned the levels of contaminants in humans. To get some answers, the Centers for Disease Control is now conducting a pilot study of local fishermen in Biscayne Bay to test if they, too, have high levels of persistent organic pollutants in their bodies. POPs have been linked to a slew of health problems in people, and according to the Environmental Protection Agency, humans are mainly exposed to POPs through contaminated foods.
I certainly am a lot more careful about how much seafood I eat of various kinds. The fish offer a lot in terms of health benefits, but they also offer a lot of threats when you start looking at the contaminants that are found in them.
All right, Jace, you got the bow line?
Got it. Ready?
Okay.
Dr. Randall Wells heads the world's longest-running dolphin research program in Sarasota Bay on Florida's west coast.
The Sarasota Dolphin Research Program, under the auspices of the Dolphin Research and Conservation Institute of the Chicago Zoological Society, has been based here at Mote Marine Laboratory actually since its start back in 1970.
There it is.
We have a span of 5 generations that we're currently observing out in Sarasota Bay as long-term residents as part of a community.
Each year, researchers conduct a health assessment of the area's dolphins.
The health assessment involves finding a selected group of dolphins in shallow water and setting a net around that group of dolphins and working with each individual one at a time on a specially designed veterinary examination boat. We take a suite of measurements, a suite of samples, we mark the animal if it's not already recognizable to us, and then release it right there on site.
One of the challenges scientists face is determining what levels of toxins are harmful to the dolphin's health, since they can't do experiments on the animals. Studies have been conducted on other species, however, and conclusions were drawn about the threshold levels in dolphins.
The threshold level is one that was established theoretically looking at other mammals, and what we find is that our males mostly are in excess of that threshold level where you would begin to expect to see health problems or reproductive problems. And we suspect this may be one of the reasons why we see hints of immune system dysfunction in the older males, why we see the older males not living as long as females.
Dr. Wells says females are thought to have a longer lifespan because they offload contaminants to their firstborn calves.
As they're putting on blubber in preparation for the winter, they're eating a lot of fat-rich fish. These fish have higher levels of the contaminants than the fish earlier in the year. It goes into the blubber of the dolphins. It stays there until the spring when the animals start to shed some of the lipids that were in their blubber. So as these contaminants are released from the blubber, they either can go to target organs and be a problem, they can be biotransformed into more lethal forms or into less lethal forms. They can be excreted in some cases, or they can be passed on in the milk to the young dolphins. And that's where one of the more serious problems occurs, we believe. We've been able to measure the levels of contaminants in females that have yet to lactate, and they are much higher than they are in older females that have given birth and have lactated. In looking at firstborn calves in Sarasota Bay, we find that they have higher levels of contaminants than do the secondborn, thirdborn, fourthborn, fifthborn, and most of the firstborn calves don't survive.
Coming up, straight ahead.
Bottlenose dolphins in the coastal waters of Florida are sentinels of ecosystem health, so we should be concerned. We shouldn't be frightened, but we should be concerned, and we should be looking as best we can at those aspects of the environment that impact us as well.
Researchers are also studying bottlenose dolphins on Florida's Atlantic coast. The Indian River Lagoon stretches along 40% or 156 miles of the state's central east coast. It is one of North America's most biologically diverse estuaries.
We have an estimated population in the Indian River Lagoon of between 800 and as many as 1,000 dolphins.
Come up on them a little bit.
Steve McCulloch is the founder and program manager of the Marine Mammal Research and Conservation Program at Harbor Branch Oceanographic Institute in Fort Pierce.
Here in the Indian River Lagoon, the primary threats facing dolphins are pollution and contaminants and the water quality. The lagoon is very sensitive. What goes in the lagoon basically stays in the lagoon.
Like their colleagues at Mote Marine Laboratory, each summer, researchers take an in-depth look at the health of the resident dolphins.
Each animal receives a full physical exam. The whole process takes about 45 minutes, and during that time we pull blood. We collect fluid samples, so fecal samples, urine samples, blowhole, gastric, milk if it's a lactating female. We ultrasonographically look at blubber measurements to see the thickness. We also take a blubber biopsy, and that's a really important data point, and we use the blubber for several different things. We look at different contaminants. We also take the skin to look at genetics, and if it's anything that has the potential to cause pain, they receive a local anesthetic for that area. We want them to be as comfortable as possible, but at the same time collect enough samples so we can get an overall picture of health for each individual.
We've looked at about 240 dolphins in 5 years and found some very disturbing trends.
For one, mercury levels in these dolphins were 21 times higher than what the Environmental Protection Agency considers safe for human consumption.
You wouldn't be allowed to eat a dolphin because the wild dolphins are so contaminated here in Florida. Mercury is a heavy metal that's a deadly neurotoxin.
In humans, that's been shown to have an effect, especially some neurodevelopmental issues, which does obviously pose a significant threat to humans, especially pregnant women who might be eating fish from a lagoon.
Mercury is released into the atmosphere from such sources as coal-fired power plants, and it eventually makes its way into the oceans, where it bioaccumulates up the food chain. Experts say they don't exactly know yet what effects high mercury levels have on the dolphins. They do know, however, that the dolphins are also facing other problems. One is a skin disease called lobomycosis.
What's unique about this disease is that it's found in dolphins and humans only. And it's found in dolphins here in the Indian River Lagoon and also in third world countries and humans that are getting it from their water systems. It's a very challenging disease because to date we have not been able to culture it in the lab. So without being able to culture it, we don't know how to cure it. Humans, the cure is simply surgical removal. We don't do that with our dolphins because the disease is so widespread, you just essentially have to remove an entire layer of their skin, and that's just not realistic for them.
And lobomycosis isn't the only skin disorder found in the Indian River Lagoon dolphins.
What we're seeing is lesions on their tongue and lesions in their genital area. And what we know now is that it's a separate papillomavirus specific to the species of dolphin. What's the big deal? Well, the concern is that these papillomas, or these warts, are now converting and becoming cancerous.
Experts say the prevalence of various types of cancer has gone up in marine mammals over the years.
That's disturbing to me, and it suggests some sort of environmental distress, that something's going on in the environment that's triggering these new things.
And there's one more troubling discovery.
In some of the dolphins we've studied, we're seeing antibiotic-resistant bacteria.
The question is how come, why? These animals are not given antibiotics. So the theory is that runoff from sewage from human sources where humans are treated with antibiotics quite regularly.
A lot of these medications, they're not broken down during sewage treatment. So they get in the lagoon and the communities of bacteria exposed to antibiotics, and eventually they do develop a resistance and that population proliferates.
It's a big issue with the CDC because potentially what you're doing is breeding bacterial superbugs. These bacteria are resistant to antibiotics that humans would need to take if they got sick with them. The problem is now that the organisms are resistant to those antibiotics. So you're breeding a superbug into the ecosystem that could come back and impact man.
Many of these pathogens are zoonotic, which means they can be transmitted from animal to human. So they're really just telling a story about the health of the environment in general, not just the health of dolphins. So it's something we should all take notice of.
The exact causal connection between contaminants and the dolphins' illnesses are still unknown. But the scientists agree that the animals' health issues raise red flags.
If we were to take all these dolphins that we've examined and sampled, almost 50% of them would be on some sort of medication if they were in a captive facility.
Here we go.
Again?
Dr. Bossert, who is trained as both a pathologist and veterinarian, says in his experience, most dolphins at captive facilities are healthier than their wild counterparts.
I think a good degree of that is due to the environmental pressures free-ranging dolphins are under right now, that these animals here are not. shifts in food supply, global climate change, shifts in water temperatures, new diseases that are emerging that we see in the free-ranging animals like cancer, new infectious diseases, new viruses that these animals don't see.
Dr. Bossert conducts regular health checks of the dolphins at Marineland, an oceanarium just south of St. Augustine, Florida.
All right, well, here comes Sunny. Good morning, Sunny.
What we're going to do with Sunny here is do a behavioral exam on him, look at him, give him a good physical using trained behaviors. Let's look at his teeth. And you get a good shot there. You look for any cavities, look for any fractures. There's an old fracture here. It's normal. So again, this is a very positive way to get really critical health information on these animals, because they're able to mask signs of being ill to the point that we can't tell when they're ill. So we have preventive medicine programs. This goes on constantly here.
Marineland is also the site of a new dolphin conservation field station, a joint venture between the Georgia Aquarium and Marineland's Dolphin Conservation Center. Researchers study the wild bottlenose dolphins in this part of Florida, further adding to the understanding of the species.
I've got him.
And we have pretty much the center part of Florida covered with the Indian River Project, and then we have a small study started in Charleston, South Carolina. So the idea is to connect the dots and see how the health of this species is along the entire East Coast.
Another person who is actively raising awareness about the plight of dolphins is filmmaker Hardy Jones. Jones has dedicated his career to protecting dolphins. Nicknamed the Dolphin Defender, he has worked with them since the 1970s. Jones was the first to get footage of a pod of dolphins in the wild, and he brought attention to their brutal slaughter off the coast of Japan. Later, he turned his attention to the potential health impacts of contaminants when large numbers of dead dolphins washed up along the east coast of the United States in the late 1980s.
There was a great mystery as to what was killing those dolphins, but what was known was that they had these, in some cases, astronomical levels of chemicals like PCBs and dioxins and things. So that was a pretty shocking thing. The chemical industry would say dilution is the solution. In other words, okay, we're pumping this stuff into the oceans, but it will get so diluted that it's not going to be a problem. But what they didn't reckon on was bioaccumulation.
In 1997, the issue of ocean contamination became personal for Jones when he was diagnosed with acute mercury poisoning.
I was feeling very fatigued and kind of muddle-headed, and so I got a test for mercury. And it came back with the mercury just popping off the chart. So I said, well, where did this come from? And at the time, I was eating swordfish and tuna 2 or 3 times a week. I thought I was eating really, really healthy food. Fortunately, if you're diagnosed with mercury and you want to get rid of it, you just don't eat fish again, and it will gradually diminish. Fish is an important component in a healthy diet, but people also have to be aware that there are a lot of fish which are not healthy, or they're not healthy in large amounts. We don't want to discourage people from eating fish and getting those omega-3 fatty acids, which are really important in heart protection, probably cancer protection. But it doesn't do you any good to eat the omega-3s and absorb a bunch of mercury or PCBs with it.
Jones suspects that it's not just the mercury in fish that can impact human health. When he was diagnosed with cancer, he began to take a closer look at persistent organic pollutants.
In 2003, I was diagnosed with multiple myeloma, which is a disease that has been on many occasions connected to toxic chemicals. So what I did is I got some of my blood tested. I wanted to see, what kind of levels do I have. And I got this report, which is huge, All of these things are indicating levels of toxic chemicals in my body. So where did I get all this stuff? And so realizing that I had it in me, and that the scientists that I spoke to, medical people, said, well, that's not unusual. I thought, it's not unusual to be loaded with these toxic chemicals.
Through his organization, bluevoice.org, Jones started a project called A Shared Fate, which draws attention to toxic chemicals in the ocean and their potential impact on marine mammal and human health.
I just started to see more and more about how these ocean contaminants are connected to disease in not only marine mammals, but in humans. For me, this tie of this disease that I was diagnosed with to the toxins in dolphins that I've studied and tried to protect and loved over all these years was kind of a striking irony.
Dolphins are magnificent creatures, loved by people around the world. As modern science strives to learn more about their health, one thing is clear. The dolphin's charismatic smile belies the silent threats lurking in their ocean home.
If you care what happens to yourself and to your children and your children's children, then you don't have a choice than to care about what happens to these dolphins.
They are an ancient species of flowering plants that grow submerged in all of the world's oceans, from the latitudes of northern Alaska to the tip of South America. Seagrasses evolved during the age of the dinosaurs nearly 100 million years ago, and are found today in bays and estuaries around the globe. In shallow tropical and subtropical waters, these prairies of the sea link the offshore coral reefs with coastal mangrove forests. They provide food and shelter for many marine species that will one day inhabit the reefs. Seagrasses and mangroves stabilize coastal sediments and create buffers against storm surge and flooding. They remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, filter contaminants from coastal waters, and add value to local economies. But seagrasses are in decline globally, and mangroves are being lost to coastal development.
These areas are degrading right now. It's not 50 years from now or 100 years from now, but it's occurring right now.
The rate at which we're losing seagrass habitat globally could result in an ecosystem collapse from the bottom of the food chain all the way up.
Will restoring seagrass and mangrove communities help sustain the ecological and economic values of the ocean's bays and estuaries? And how will rising sea levels impact their survival in the future? Over the last few decades, worldwide human populations have increased dramatically along coastlines. At the same time, seagrasses have declined at a rate of nearly 7% per year, a rate higher than the loss of coral reefs or tropical rainforests. Stormwater runoff from coastal communities and human activities along the shoreline contribute to the decline. Boat groundings and anchor damage add to the problem. Unlike the more recognizable icons of the seas, the value of seagrasses and mangroves can be easily overlooked.
If you just casually read newspapers and places that science stories are published, you often read about tropical forests, you often read about coral reefs, and occasionally you'll even read about mangroves, but you almost never read about seagrasses. Seagrasses are the Rodney Dangerfield of coastal marine ecosystems. They really get no respect.
But researchers have discovered that seagrasses and mangroves deserve a great deal of respect for their many values in the ocean.
Seagrasses keep erosion down, they lock sediments into the bottom, and they actually remove sediments from the water column. When that happens, that maintains a clear water column, so a lot of light reaches the bottom. If the seagrasses were to disappear, then all of a sudden they're no longer holding these sediments in place. Sediments get up in the water, and the water becomes very, very turbid.
That's really important when you're thinking about areas that are heavily populated, where folks like to recreate, where sediments can be stirred up. They kind of root them down and keep them stable. And they provide some hurricane protection, much like mangroves do on a global scale. You've got seagrasses and mangroves that break wave action when storms come, and that also provide nature's way of stabilizing the shoreline.
We live in an area of the world where we get these catastrophic storm events, hurricanes and tropical storms, and when they hit the coast, they can definitely create erosion problems. And what we find is that areas that are protected or buffered by mangrove forest and wetlands tend to do much better. And then we lose a lot of coastline in areas where we've removed mangroves and replaced them with things like seawalls.
Still, some of the most important values of these resources are less obvious.
It's been shown about a hectare of seagrass, which is equivalent to a soccer field, can use the same amount of nitrogen that would come from treated sewage from 800 people in 1 year. And then if you're looking at the carbon numbers, seagrass can fix the same amount of carbon per meter squared in a year that you would produce by driving your car 7,500 miles. Just the amount of nitrogen that they pick up is worth $19,000 a year for that one little spot of seagrass. And you start to look at everything else that's associated with them, you're not talking a monetary amount for fisheries, because you've got the shrimp industry down here in South Florida, you've got all of the sports fishing, as well as most of the fish from either the mangroves or the coral reefs having some sort of connection with seagrass.
Seagrasses and mangroves provide the nursery habitat, the foundation of our ecosystem. And without having a healthy nursery habitat where fishery industries can survive and our tourism industry thrives, because we've got this industry that depends on having nice clear water and habitat where fish can grow, both for sustainability and sustenance for people to eat, and also for our tourism industry where people like to recreate. From the basic part of that food chain up through human consumption, you would have really an ecosystem collapse.
It certainly is a crisis. Seagrasses are very valuable for the ecosystem services they provide, besides being just hotspots of biodiversity and beautiful places to visit.
I'm fascinated by seagrass habitats. On the surface, you look at a seagrass habitat and you see a bunch of green grass, essentially that doesn't look too different from your lawn, for example. But seagrasses, or the habitats, are incredibly complex. There's so many different organisms that live there. There's so many different biogeochemical cycles and processes that are going on in there. If you put your face up close to a seagrass habitat, you'll be amazed at the number of different things that you'll see on the small scale.
In the subtropical waters of southeast Florida, neighboring metropolitan Miami Biscayne Bay Aquatic Preserve manages nearly 70,000 acres of submerged land. Nearly 3/4 of that is covered by seagrass. Mangrove forested islands and shorelines grow adjacent to these seagrass communities. The most common variety, red mangroves, are found growing at the water's edge. Behind them, black mangroves, and farther upland, white mangroves. Historically, Biscayne Bay received fresh water from the Everglades, but in modern times, the hydrology has been altered by drainage canals, channelized rivers, and changes in the flow of groundwater into the bay. The diversity of species has also changed, but it still remains an estuary where fresh water and salt water meet.
One of the things that we do is form partnerships with local resource agencies, universities, researchers who are looking at what the resources are in Biscayne Bay so that we can get a better understanding of what's there now, but also how have things changed and how are they changing.
Marine biologists are monitoring salinity, sediments, and organisms that live on seagrasses found in Biscayne Bay with a long-term goal of determining what effect a new freshwater canal flowing into the bay will have on the ecosystem.
This project is directly related to the Everglades Restoration Project, and what's going to be happening is the freshwater regime of South Florida is going to be changing, and everybody that's involved wants to try to get an idea of what and how these changes are going to be affecting what's already here. Overall, if you have salinities changing on a much larger scale, then you start getting into chemistry a lot more, how warmer waters are going to be, acidifying with higher levels of CO2. That's going to be affecting how the sediments actually work or don't work. It starts to get pretty ugly pretty quick. We don't know exactly what's going to happen.
Photo archival data of the seagrass beds is recorded with a specially designed boat and shallow water positioning system known as swaps.
We got a glass bottom boat so that you can see the stuff that's out there. We've got a digital camera attached to the glass bottom. We can move that around as we need to. That runs directly through a computer, goes straight to a hard drive. We've got GPS, so it codes every photo with exactly where it is. Even if we're doing a straight line or just trying to sit in one spot, that each one of these is tagged so precisely that we can follow it around, because seagrass doesn't grow all the time as just one big meadow like your yard. There's going to be little patches of it. This gives us a nice snapshot of the community as it is right up against the mangroves and how that changes as it moves into a little bit deeper water. And we're going out and year after year taking photo quadrats basically, and so that way in the future we can always come back if we need to check for any specific organisms or any specific changes that we may have missed on our preliminary analysis.
Seagrass and mangrove communities in Biscayne Bay nurture juvenile fish and marine creatures that feed and find shelter here. Some will make their way offshore to the coral reefs. Others will live out their entire life cycles in the bay. More than 100 bottlenose dolphins reside in the bay, stalking fish around the seagrass beds. Seagrasses are a primary food source for manatees, but as opportunistic feeders, they will consume low-hanging mangrove leaves. Seagrasses in tropical and subtropical bays and estuaries around the world have a relationship with mangroves, like prairies do to forests on land.
A good example of this is along the mangrove fringe down in the southern part of the aquatic preserve near Chicken Key in the Deering Estate. You've got an expansive mangrove forest right adjacent to the shoreline, and then out from that for a few miles you've got dense seagrass beds.
The prop roots of mangrove trees supply food and shelter to some of the same marine organisms and fish that are found in seagrass beds. Because many near-shore and offshore species rely on mangroves as a nursery, when mangrove habitat is lost, fisheries soon decline. Human impacts on these ecosystems are a clear challenge for resource managers. In the 1960s, developers acquired a section of shoreline in the northern tributary of the bay and cleared the mangrove forest to dredge and build a marina. Years later, the site was acquired to form a part of the Alita River State Park. Today it's being restored to its natural condition as a mangrove wetland.
This is a red mangrove propagule that has just started to put out some roots and some leaves. As you can see, they're about 6 to sometimes 9 inches in length, and they come off the tree as a very cigar-shaped, some people say it's pencil-shaped, very long sort of propagule seed. And they float in the system until they find some substrate, and the one end is a little bit heavier than the other end, and it tends to take root and get in an upright position. And again, you have to remember the water is going up and down as this is all happening. And then once it starts to establish some roots into the substrate, it'll start to grow. And the mangroves grow about 2 feet a year. They differ from one location to the other, but that's a pretty good average. The red mangroves will grow up to 150 feet if they didn't have impacts as far as storm impacts. And in this area, we see them 80 to 100 feet tall. Unfortunately, our frequency of hurricane here is great, and as a result, our mangroves is not as tall as some of the ones in Southeast Asia where they have a lower frequency of storm events.
These channelways feeding into the site were designed at -3 feet.
It's really been exciting. In our restoration plans, we not only just have a plain of mangroves, but we also have these tidal creeks and channels and tidal pools. And it's amazing to see the life, the abundance of life that comes in and it succeeds through time. We've seen fisheries that have come into areas, and just the species richness or the number of different types of fish or crabs or shrimp have just gone right off the graph as far as the number of individuals and the diversity, the different types that come into an area once it gets established. My biggest thrill about all of this is pretty much at a stage that we're at now with this project here, where we're pretty much concluding the construction. We're starting to plant the site with volunteers, and that's another big part of this effort, is to try to get the community in to obtain a sense of ownership, stewardship with the project, and families come out and can plant these mangroves and come back and see the abundance of life and what they've done and feel a part of the overall restoration.
But balancing resource management and restoration with recreational use is a steady challenge, particularly for specialists in Biscayne National Park, located at the southern end of the bay. It's a shallow water environment with submerged resources like seagrasses and coral reefs, a popular recreational area, but one that's frequently impacted by boat groundings and propeller scarring.
We're trying to put the sediment back in the holes or the scars themselves. Seagrasses cannot grow well into the water column itself. They need sediment to grow in. So until we replace that, those injuries take years and years and years to recover, if at all. We're putting in sediment that's very fine, and it can cause a very large turbidity plume in the water, which is not a good thing. We're actually required through state water quality standards to control that turbidity very carefully. So we will put up the yellow construction boom around the site that we're going to be working at and make sure that there's really very little option for leaking. Then we'll bring the sediment in on barges. Sometimes we use containerized sediment, for example, in a burlap bag, and sometimes we put the sediment that's loose. We use a crane, some kind of crane, to actually put it in the hole. We have divers in the water feeling out the surface with their feet to figure out where we need to put more, so we can kind of place the sediment exactly where it needs to be. And the other thing the divers are doing is collecting water samples for turbidity monitoring.
In the final phase of this restoration, healthy seagrasses will be transplanted to the site. a method having great success in the Channel Islands National Park off the coast of Southern California.
All right, I'm in.
The rich seagrass habitats of the Channel Islands sustain an abundance of marine life, offering food for some and shelter for others. Some of its species are found nowhere else in the world. Here, resource managers are harvesting healthy seagrasses to transplant in damaged areas. This 5-year-old restoration project has expanded the seagrass beds up to a mile away, adding new habitat for a diversity of species. But it takes an informed public to share the responsibility for sustaining these ecosystems. And resource managers want to engage people as well as local governments in promoting the best ways to enjoy the bays and estuaries while protecting the resources.
On behalf of Miami-Dade County and this community, do hereby proclaim March 2010 as Seagrass Awareness Month.
Very good.
But will human intervention be enough and in time to make a difference?
One of the things that is at the forefront of everyone's mind is we're managing these areas, but what does that mean in 25 years or 50 or 100 years? This will be underwater, this island that we're sitting on right now. So it's a quandary.
In southwest Florida's 10,000 islands, bottlenose dolphins corral their prey in one of the most productive mangrove estuaries in the world. From the air, the islands look much the same as they have for thousands of years. But today, they are ground zero for researchers trying to solve one of the great scientific problems of the future, predicting sea level rise. At Rookery Bay National Estuarine Research Reserve, scientists are trying to determine how changing seas will affect the 10,000 islands, mangrove forests, and low-lying coastline.
We know without a doubt that sea level rise is increasing, and it's actually an accelerated increase. That puts communities in Southwest Florida at risk, not just here in Southwest Florida, but I would say particularly so here because people who live on Marco Island and Naples and the surrounding areas are living in communities in these built landscapes in a very low-lying elevation. A lot of the mangroves that we have around Rookery Bay are actually growing on living oyster reef. And if the water quality conditions are good, and in most cases in Rookery Bay that is the case, as the reef slowly expands, then we can also see an expansion of mangroves that occurs at the same time.
Oysters have a tendency to grow up at a certain rate off of the seafloor. And if those oyster reefs are growing faster than sea level is going up, the oyster reefs become emergent. They come out of the water, and then they become areas for recruitment for mangroves. So what was an oyster reef becomes a mangrove forested island. And those mangrove forested islands have snaking-like shapes, dendritic kinds of patterns. And it's those islands that give the 10,000 islands their name. Now that sea level rise has accelerated, that rate of sea level rise is faster than oysters can grow, so that balance will shift and has already shifted, and it's quite possible, I would venture to say likely, that the 10,000 islands will disappear given the current rate of sea level rise, which will completely change the configuration of the coast and completely change the estuarine ecology of the coast, because those 10,000 islands also serve as entrapments for freshwater that create the brackish water that serves as the nurseries, serves as a place for seagrass development, serves as a place for other oyster reef development. That's all likely to change.
Researchers are studying sediment samples from the 10,000 islands to determine changes over time in the mangrove communities as a consequence of sea level rise. These sediments indicate a shoreward retreat of southwest Florida's mangrove coastline. They're also finding evidence of saltwater intrusion in the freshwater marshes of the 10,000 Islands National Wildlife Refuge. Arrays of circular subtidal ponds have been photographed from the air. Patches of mangroves are taking root where only freshwater plants once grew, another sign of sea level rise.
Since humans have become industrialized, since humans have been recording history in history books, we've been around during times of modest sea level rise rates, and we have barrier islands and bays and 10,000 islands and Biscayne bays and Florida bays. Those are all there because a modest rate of sea level rise has allowed those features to develop. Now, and we see that in the sediments over the last 5,000 years. Now, flash forward to industrialized world and climate change and enrichment of CO2 in the atmosphere. There's clearly a record in those sediments that sea level is accelerating.
Scientists project the retreat of southwest Florida's coastline if sea level should rise from its current level, 1 meter at a time, up to an additional 9 meters.
Projections for much faster rises in sea level over the next 100 or 200 years would suggest to us that the area we're standing in now will soon be underwater. So one may ask the question, why bother protecting the seagrasses here if the coast is going to migrate away from here? Well, one reason is because there always will be a coast, and seagrasses will continue to respond and move shoreward as sea level goes up, as long as humans don't armor the coast to such a point that a wall is built around human cities and they continue to go up as sea level comes up.
But how fast will these changes occur? And will seagrasses and mangroves continue to yield their many ecological and economic values with the changing seas? For today's researchers, these questions are part of an experiment in progress, with the answers waiting somewhere in the future. She transported troops to the battlefields of World War II, took refugees to distant shores, and later helped win the Cold War. Left abandoned for years as part of the Ghost Fleet, the USNS General Hoyt S. Vandenberg has at last found her final resting place in the bright blue waters of the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary.
The Vandenberg is just about 2 football fields long and 10 stories tall. And that makes Vandenberg the largest ship deployed in any marine sanctuary anywhere in the world.
The first time I dove it, I hit the deck, and it was like, which way do I go? It was overwhelming, the amount of things to look at on that wreck.
In her last mission as an artificial reef, the Vandenberg is attracting marine life as well as scuba divers and fishermen.
I've noticed huge amounts of what they call fish balls. You swim through these and they scatter and then they form around you again.
It's an ever-changing canvas of marine life.
South Florida is home to the world's 3rd largest barrier reef, and many shipwrecks lie buried in her clear, warm waters.
We do have the three largest artificial reefs in the world. The Oriskany being the largest, which is an aircraft carrier off of Pensacola, about 900 feet long. And then the Vandenberg comes in a distant second at 520 feet, but it's still a very excellent reef for diving. And then, of course, the Spiegel Grove down in Key Largo, which is a little bit shorter, about 512 feet.
In the turquoise blue waters of the Florida Keys, a new attraction is drawing scuba divers from around the world. The USNS General Hoyt S. Vandenberg sunk 7 miles off Key West in the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. It is the newest addition to the Florida Keys Wreck Trek.
There's no wreck that I've ever been on that can compare to the Vandenberg in words, and I've dove on many wrecks. I can say that it's one of the most unique dives I've ever had, and I look forward to it each time. I want to go down one more time.
Built in the 1940s at the Kaiser Shipyard in California, she began her life as the General Harry Taylor.
Its first mission in World War II was as a troop transport. It was at that time a USS, a U.S. naval vessel, and it carried troops mostly to the European and the Pacific theaters.
The war had ended in Europe, and we're getting ready for the invasion of Japan. And we were on our way, and the captain decided to come across the Atlantic and go through Panama to go to Manila. The second day after the bombing in Nagasaki, the captain got on and made the announcement. He said, "Men, watch the bow. The ship will be turning head for her." And we all, you could hear a pin drop in the Atlantic, because he could have said Calcutta, Canada, whatever. He said New York. And here we have all these men, 3,500 men on board ship, and you could almost feel the ship coming out of the water for joy that we were definitely going to go home.
After the war, the ship was briefly decommissioned and then recommissioned as the USNS Taylor.
Its mission during those years was as a transport mostly for people who were displaced from Iron Curtain countries, concentration camp survivors, other prisoners of war. They came to the United States, Australia, and New Zealand.
In 1958, the Taylor was decommissioned again and sent to the mothball fleet in Beaumont, Texas. But before long, this World War II ship was acquired by the Air Force and refitted for duty in the space age.
Just 8 working days after June 24, 1961, when the United States Air Force selected Sperry Rand Corporation as systems manager, a World War II C-4 troop ship was removed from the Hudson River Reserve Fleet and started on its way to becoming, in an extremely short time, the most instrumented tracking ship ever conceived. This first ship, the General R.E. Callan, and a sister ship, the General Taylor from the Beaumont, Texas Reserve Fleet, were destined to become Aris 1 and 2, the first 2 advanced range instrumentation ships, extending instrumentation coverage of the Atlantic missile range to over 9,000 miles.
It took thousands of man-hours to convert the vintage transport vessel into a mobile missile tracking station. Outfitted with the latest technology of the time, her mission would be to provide exact data on all phases of a missile's performance, from launch through termination of flight. It was during this time that she was renamed the USAFS General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, after one of the founding fathers of the United States Air Force. After 2 years of intense work, she was ready to assume her new duties.
Bearing the proud name of General Hoyt S. Vandenberg, the second advanced range instrumentation ship was officially inducted into service at a dedication ceremony in Baltimore, Maryland.
It was originally the USAFS, one of the few ships to carry the designation U.S. Air Force ship. She tracked ICBM launches, ours and the Russian launches. A lot of the operations were covert, very secret. She tracked the early Apollo and Gemini missions. It had some very sophisticated technology for the time on board. Those 2 big univacs, each one had about a meg of memory. your watch has more today, but it was state of the art at the time. And it was used to process all of the positioning data.
Within a year, the ship was again acquired by the Navy and recommissioned as USNS General Hoyt S. Vandenberg.
The Navy took the ship back and hired civilian crew from Pan Am and RCA that actually manned the technology. The RCA guys that served on Vandenberg during the Cold War eras say with confidence that they feel that she contributed substantially to the ultimate fall of the Berlin Wall. Her Florida connection is that she was based at Canaveral.
In 1983, after 20 years of service, the ship was transferred to the Maritime Administration, or MARID Reserve Fleet, on the James River in Virginia.
It's where old U.S. ships go to die. Because of various regulations, they can't just be sent off to India to be busted up with sledgehammers. And the economics of salvaging them, it was such that for a good deal of that time, it cost more to cut them up than you would have gained from it.
Except for a short stint as the movie set for the film Virus, during which time Cyrillic lettering was added to her hull, the Vandenberg sat abandoned as part of the Ghost Fleet in Virginia. Eventually, she was struck from the Naval Register until, in 1999, some dedicated people from Key West decided she would make an ideal artificial reef.
Having the Vandenberg here for the city of Key West is good for two reasons: the environment and the economy.
The Keys being a worldwide dive destination, and the numbers in divers was declining, and the businesses could feel that, so this would be a boost to that side of the economy. And the other side was the ecological side, the artificial reefs being a point for divers to go to and stay off of the reefs, which are under tremendous stress right now.
There were a lot of things that made the Vandenberg a really primo selection. The Vandenberg had a really cool history that nobody knew about. The Vandenberg had the iconic radar dishes on the top and a really cool profile. We didn't want some old tanker. We wanted something that was unique. Further, we looked at how people used artificial reefs for recreation, for fishing and diving, snorkeling, and glass-bottom boats. And we got all of those things in the Vandenberg.
A lot of time and effort went into selecting the ideal site where the ship would eventually be sunk.
We actually help valet park the ships. And in fact, we go out and select the bottom. We work with the contractors that are representing the interest group that are putting the ships out. And I send out some of our specialists that know the habitats, and we make sure we get it just far enough off the natural reef to not be a threat to the natural reef.
The requirements that were necessary for the site was that it was on barren bottom. And we made hundreds of dives out there to assure that there was no live rock or fish habitat. Some other things that went into consideration were, can a submarine hide on the other side of the wreck? A draft clearance for cruise ships and how far away from the ship channel. And we did a lot of dives with handheld magnetometers to make sure there were no Spanish galleons buried in the sand underneath where the ship went. So it was quite an involved process.
Some people question whether or not shipwrecks should be sunk as artificial reefs inside a national marine sanctuary.
When the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary was designated by an act of Congress in 1990, there were 3 projects underway by the Keys dive community to sink artificial reefs in the Florida Keys. We agreed that we would allow the 3 projects that were underway to continue, and that we would really focus on trying to gather the science that we needed to see if these were disrupting the natural habitat and what they were doing socioeconomically to the areas where they were being placed. In fact, of our 14 sites, the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary is the only one to allow ships to be sunk intentionally as artificial reefs. Now, clearly, we are the largest site for diving activity. That's very important for the economy, for the Florida Keys. I'm not saying that it fits all sanctuaries. In fact, it may not fit any of our other national marine sanctuaries.
Once the ship was selected, the long, hard process of planning and fundraising began to bring the ship to Key West.
We dealt with 18 different government agencies, and we had to make them all happy. Boy, I'll tell you, in the old days, you used to just knock a hole in the bottom and let them go, and that game has changed. It's breathtaking, the amount of paperwork and work that have gone into this. We've had to jump through ever smaller and ever much more flaming hoops all the way to do this. Everything from money to legal to accounting to the physical work of it, the insurance, tugboats. You know, they told you the Titanic was unsinkable. Geez, this one here, holy guacamole, it only took 3 years to build it, and it's taken 13 to sink.
A lot of cleanup work went into readying the Vandenberg for her final mission. After being towed from the Ghost Fleet, she spent 2 years at a shipyard in Norfolk, Virginia.
It became very difficult to clean it up to the levels that we needed to clean it up. During the process of cleanup, the EPA and MARAD came out with a joint document for best management practices for cleaning a ship like this. So prior to that, we didn't really have a set methodology and protocols for cleaning a ship.
We took over 100 miles of possibly PCB containing wire out of the ship. We took over 70 watertight doors. The ship had 500,000 gallons of fuel on it, lots of machinery, duct work, insulation. We even had guys climbing in some of the big pieces of machinery, cleaning with Q-tips to clean this thing out. So it was a very meticulous, long process. It involved something over 80,000 man-hours.
In April of 2009, the ship was finally ready for her last voyage down the Atlantic seaboard. Once the Vandenberg reached Key West, it was time for the final month of cleanup and prep work before sink day.
We had to encapsulate all the loose asbestos because they didn't want an asbestos cloud coming out when it sank.
The masts were cut down and welded down on the deck. The dishes were lowered. The ship was prepared like no other ship's ever been prepared as far as the holes that were cut to allow the water to flood her evenly.
Joe and his team worked closely with experts from the Stevens Institute of Technology in New Jersey to devise and test a solid sink plan for the massive ship.
This had never been done before, but we figured that, in order to ensure the best results, that we would get the most talented people. With a project that cost that much and meant that much to this community, we wanted to make sure it got done right.
Shortly before the ship was ready to be sunk,
good morning.
It was time for some final goodbyes.
Going to see an old buddy, the USNS Vandenberg, home for a goodly number of people for a long, long time. Yeah, there's lots of memories.
It's been sitting in a storage not being useful for a long time. And I think turning it into a reef for fishing and for diving and things is a positive outcome. Its sister went to the boneyard in Taiwan in about 84, 85 and was broken up and turned into razor blades and small toys and stuff like that. So this is a much better fate.
We were thrilled that where she was going, she would keep her name and her place in history.
Building steel back in 44.
After years of hard work, the day had come when the Vandenberg would reach her ultimate resting place. With hundreds of onlookers and crew in place, the ship was towed to her final destination.
You shall always promise never to forget.
The Vandenberg was sunk on May 27, 2009, and there was never a better day in my whole life.
She sailed all the oceans.
Ship sank in right around 2 minutes. It was 7 seconds different than our modeling had said. So again, it wasn't perfect, but within a range we could live with.
They're sinking the Vandenberg.
Once the ship was on the bottom, a team of expert safety divers had to make sure that the ship had sunk according to plan.
We had to confirm under state law that all of the cutting charges had detonated properly before we could open the vessel to the public, who was standing by very anxiously to get on the ship.
Fortunately, all charges had detonated, and the ship was standing upright in the sand.
This project went very, very close to perfect.
Turning this former missile tracking ship into an artificial reef was no cheap task.
It actually wound up to be a little over $8 million. The city of Key West put up $1.3 million. Monroe County put up $2 million. The Tourist Development Council put up another $1 million, and the state of Florida picked up the rest, and the Maritime Administration put in about $1.3 million.
What we have found is artificial reefs are very much economic generators for the local community, particularly when you look at cost-benefit analysis, how much it costs to put the reef in as opposed to how much benefit the community has gathered from that artificial reef. The numbers are pretty impressive. In Monroe County, it was $217 of economic benefit to the county for every dollar that was put into the artificial reef program. It's hard to think of another public works project that brings in that kind of economic benefit to a community.
It didn't take long for Key West businesses to see a positive impact from having the Vandenberg nearby. Dive shop operators Bob Holston and C.C. Roycraft say it has exceeded their expectations.
It actually helped us to achieve our best year in business in almost 40 years of business. And it was attributed directly to the Vandenberg, because the numbers were either flat or down prior to the sinking of the Vandenberg. After the Vandenberg went down, the numbers just skyrocketed. We've had people come from as far as Brazil, groups coming in from Norway, from Germany, just about anywhere in Europe.
It was really great to see the shipwreck, and I was really impressed by diving there.
The Vandenberg is the newest addition to the Florida Keys Wreck Trek, which starts with the Spiegel Grove in Key Largo.
In between, we have the Bib and the Duane, the Thunderbolt, the Dolphins Bush, and these are all just really great wreck dives. Nowhere else on the planet can you visit so many warships in such a short area.
Having the Vandenberg in Key West has many divers excited. Former treasure hunter Pat Klein, who helped uncover the famous Spanish galleon Nuestra Señora de Atocha off Key West, has hidden a special treat on the wreck.
I thought to myself, wouldn't it be great if there was some other sunken treasure that divers could find? And the more I thought about it, the more I realized that it could be something from a Spanish galleon. So I got a grade 1 coin, and I purchased at the hardware store one of those tin boxes that you keep keys in, that you fasten to your car. I fastened the coin to a part of the ship magnetically, where it still resides, waiting for somebody to recover it. Hopefully somebody's going to find that, and they're going to maybe just a little bit experience what I had the opportunity to experience for over 30 years.
Now that the shipwreck is on the ocean floor, natural resources managers are trying to determine what impact this artificial reef has on fish populations and the health of the surrounding natural reefs.
Just as we wouldn't go into a forest and cut a tree down and make a telephone pole and have a bird land on that telephone pole and say, see there, we provided new habitat, we shouldn't be doing that with artificial reefs. We need to call it like it is and point out that they're placed there as a tool to attract divers from the natural reefs. We're not placing them there for fisheries management purposes, but we want to see them there to relieve some of the diving activity on the natural reefs.
2 different monitoring projects are underway to study the impacts the shipwreck is having on its natural surroundings.
One being a user study where we compared the use of the natural reef system, the reefs and the artificial reefs, in the vicinity of Vandenberg for a year prior to the ship going in, And then we are in the middle of doing that for 1 year after the ship went in to determine if the user pattern changes, if people are actually not using the natural reefs quite as much as they were before.
Opinions differ on whether or not the placement of an artificial reef helps take pressure off the natural reefs.
The benefits have been good to most of the dive shops in Key West. I think that's also telling us a lot of the divers are moving off the natural reefs to the artificial reefs.
The Vandenberg has been heavily promoted as a dive site and a dive attraction, which of course brings people in that may not ordinarily be here. So we actually may see a net increase in diving on both the Vandenberg and adjacent natural reefs. People that dive the ship are probably going to dive the reefs as well. So from that standpoint, it's great economically, but I don't know if we will be able to say that it's taking pressure off of natural reef sites.
In the upper Florida Keys near Key Largo, diving pressure on the natural reefs did slightly decrease after the sinking of the ship Spiegel Grove.
There was less pressure on the natural reef by a pretty small amount, about 14%. For the first year after the Spiegel Grove went down, we don't have any real information beyond that first year.
It's too soon to tell whether the Vandenberg will produce similar results. In the meantime, however, experts do agree that it is already attracting large numbers of fish.
There wasn't much there before the ship went down. After the first month of being on the bottom, the ship had already attracted over 40 species of fish, and now we're up over 100 species that we've documented already.
The Reef Environmental Education Foundation is conducting the second part of the monitoring, which involves diving the site before the ship was placed on the bottom, followed by a quarterly monitoring over the next year, and then biannual monitoring over the 2 years after that.
Reef was contracted by the state of Florida to look at the fish populations on the Vandenberg and 7 other adjacent reef areas to look at how the wreck recruited new fish and enhanced fish populations, and if the ship itself affected populations of fish on the natural reefs. I think what we're seeing so far is that the wreck is actually enhancing populations. Of course, it depends on the usage on that site as well. If there's heavy fishing pressure, then could see a net loss because the fish may be attracted from a widespread area and concentrated on the wreck, making them easier to catch. But I don't think we're seeing that. I think we're seeing a lot of diving going on the wreck, non-extractive activities, and I think the wreck is serving to enhance populations at this point anyway.
Scientists say there are still more questions that have to be answered to consider this project a complete environmental success.
We have to be focused on all the risk involved. The environmental risk, what happens as these ships deteriorate over the next 100 years? We're not talking about just our generation, but what about the future? We can't ever underestimate the need to protect the natural habitats, the coral reefs of the Florida Keys. That's the gem, that's the jewel of South Florida.
The USNS General Hoyt S. Vandenberg served its country for nearly 40 years. Now, instead of its memory fading to the pages of history books, it continues to attract and amaze scuba divers from around the world.
It's an underwater Disneyland.
Diving the Vandenberg is like seeing the Grand Canyon for the first time. It'll take your breath away. Sure, there are famous ones way out in the Pacific and in other places, and they're fantastic, but this is the one you can drive to.